1882. Wyoming. A mother, alone with her 2 daughters, faces a winter so cruel it could take everything. Snow bites, hunger gnaws, and survival seems impossible. But someone arrives, carrying more than food, carrying hope. Stay with us, because what happens next will change everything. Watch where you're seeing this video in the comments, and if stories like this move you, subscribe now. Snow had a way of swallowing sound in those hills. By the winter of 1882, it felt as if the world itself had fallen into silence. My boots sank deep into the drifts that covered the ridge, the cold gnawing through wool and leather until it reached bone. Every breath turned into a cloud, drifting away before my eyes. I had seen harsh winters before, but this one carried a weight, something heavier than the snow itself. It pressed down on roofs, on fence rails, and most of all on the people left behind to endure it. It was during one of those dim afternoons, when the sky hung low and grey, that I first noticed the smoke. A thin curl rising from the battered chimney of the Odell place, halfway up Widow's Ridge. Folks said the family had been abandoned, left to scrape by with nothing but hunger and whatever scraps could be coaxed from the land. I knew the stories. Everyone did. Most folks repeated them around stoves in town, and then carried on with their own worries. But the truth of hardship has a way of sticking to me, like frost that never melts. I remember the way my horse shifted beneath me, uneasy against the sharp wind, as I stared at that chimney. Something about it pulled me closer, though I told myself I had no reason to ride that way. Maybe it was the memory of what it felt like to be left behind. Maybe it was the sight of smoke rising where many thought no fire still burned. Either way, I nudged the gelding forward, climbing the slope toward a house that looked more broken than lived in. The place bore scars of neglect, shutters clinging to rusted hinges, window panes patched with burlap, boards bowed from too many storms. I could almost feel the chill seeping out through the cracks. No one should have had to survive in such a place, not with winter closing its fist around us. I carried bread wrapped in cloth and a bottle of milk I had tucked into my saddlebag that morning. It wasn't much, but it was something. The weight of those simple things felt heavier than any rifle or rope I had ever carried. My knuckles rapped gently against the weathered wood of the door, and after a pause, it opened just a fraction. A pale face peeked out, too young for such worry, freckles scattered across skin that had seen more hunger than sunlight. Her eyes carried suspicion, but also the quiet hope of a child who wanted to believe in kindness. I stepped inside for only a moment, long enough to see another little one curled beneath a quilt, cheeks flushed from the cold, and beyond her, a woman kneeling at the hearth. She looked up, strands of hair falling loose around a tired face. It was not the kind of weariness that came from sleepless nights. It was deeper, carved into her posture, etched into the way she stood, as though every breath was earned with effort. She didn't ask for help, but she didn't turn it away either. I left the bread and milk by the stove and stepped back into the cold, the image of her eyes burning into me more than the wind ever could. That night, long after the fire in my own hearth had burned low, I still saw them in my mind, the children clinging to warmth, the woman holding herself together as if the world demanded it. The next day I rode back, and the day after that, each time with something different: eggs, salt pork, potatoes. My visits were short, my words few. I told myself it was just the decent thing to do, that anyone else would have done the same. But I knew better. Each ride up that ridge stitched something into me, a thread pulling tighter with every return. By the end of the week, the little one, Vera, I later learned, was the first to the door, a gap-toothed smile lighting her face when she saw me. And though the woman still carried her guard like armor, I began to see color return to her cheeks, a softness to her gaze that hadn't been there before. I did not know then how much those small rides would change me. I only knew that the cold no longer felt so sharp, and that the silence of winter was broken, not by the wind, not by the snow, but by the fragile sound of life continuing where so many expected it to fade. The mornings were always the sharpest, when the wind seemed to punch through even the thickest layers. I learned quickly that the Odell place demanded more than just courage. It demanded endurance. Each time I approached the ridge, the house looked smaller somehow, trapped under the weight of snow, the roof sagging under its burden. The girls' laughter had been absent when I first arrived, replaced by the constant crunch of boots on frost-hardened earth and the soft sigh of wind slipping through cracks. Now, though, the quiet was different. It carried life. I remember one morning in particular, when I rode up with a bundle of kindling strapped behind my saddle and a tin of salted pork wrapped in cloth. The path was slick with frost, and the horses' hooves scuffed snow that was hard as iron. The sun had not yet climbed above the horizon, and the sky was a pale slate, streaked with the soft gold of early light. I could see the smoke from the chimney curling into the air, a ribbon of warmth in a frozen world. Lorien was already outside when I arrived, arms crossed, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Her gaze lingered on the ridge, and for a moment she did not acknowledge me. The children stayed close to her side, Clara holding Vera's hand as if to shield her from the cold. I dismounted, brushing snow from my coat, and laid the bundles at her feet. She accepted them with a nod, not a word, and I knew better than to push. Silence had become our shared language, each of us learning to speak in deeds rather than in conversation. She moved with a quiet grace that belied the hardships she endured. Watching her, I understood the depth of the weight she carried, raising 2 children alone in a place where snow could bury you alive and winter storms could snap even the sturdiest beams. Yet she faced it all with a determination that seemed almost unnatural, like the ridge itself had carved resilience into her bones. I spent the morning helping her repair a section of fence that had been torn away in a recent storm. My hands ached from hammering, from bending over rough-hewn timber, but it was a satisfying pain. Lorien's eyes followed my work, though she never spoke of it, never allowed herself the luxury of praise. Still, there was something in the way she observed, a quiet acknowledgment that mattered more than words. The children lingered nearby, sometimes asking questions in the soft, tentative voices of the young. Clara wanted to know how the horse could carry me up the steep incline without slipping, while Vera simply watched, fascinated by the way I could handle the tools. I showed them little tricks, teaching them to respect the land and the work it demanded, all the while noticing how the older girl's face softened when she thought no one was looking. By midday, the sun had risen enough to warm our backs, though the wind continued to bite. Lorien moved to gather water from the well, the pails swinging with a rhythm she had perfected over countless winters. I followed, lifting one pail to ease the strain on her shoulders. It was a small gesture, yet it carried meaning, a sharing of burdens that words could never express. The days grew longer, though the cold persisted. My visits became a part of the rhythm of their lives, as routine and necessary as the rising of the sun. Each day I brought something: food, supplies, a scrap of clothing, or simply my presence. And each day I felt the subtle shift in Lorien's demeanor, a softening of the lines on her face, a quiet trust that I had been determined to earn. I began to notice the smallest things, the way she hummed while tending the fire, the careful way she braided Vera's hair before school, the tenderness with which she handed Clara a slice of bread. These moments were fleeting, yet they stayed with me. Impressions burned into my memory like the first glow of dawn over the frozen ridge. One evening, as I prepared to leave, Lorien pressed a small tin cup into my hands. Inside, a warm infusion of spruce tips and honey. She didn't speak, only watched me drink, her gaze steady, almost reverent. It was the kind of gift that carried more than warmth. It carried acknowledgment, trust, and a subtle invitation into a world she had kept guarded for too long. The children had gone to bed by the time I mounted my horse, leaving me alone with the ridge and the falling snow. The moonlight caught the tops of the pines, illuminating the frost in a pale silver. I rode slowly, not wanting to leave too abruptly, knowing that each mile between their house and mine stretched longer than the distance itself. My heart carried a weight heavier than any saddlebag, a sense of responsibility and an emerging attachment that I could not ignore. Night after night I returned, my presence a quiet constant in the small world of the Odell place. I learned their routines, their struggles, and their triumphs, and slowly I became part of the rhythm I had once merely observed from a distance. There was no grand declaration, no loud promise of loyalty, just the quiet insistence that I would arrive, and that I would remain. I realized then that survival was not just about food, fire, and shelter. It was about trust, about offering oneself even when the world seemed determined to withhold everything. Lorian's resilience became a mirror for my own, and through the cold, the wind, and the relentless march of winter, I found something I had not expected, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere decency. The Odell place, once a house of struggle and isolation, began to breathe differently. Every day I arrived, every loaf of bread, every pail of water, every bundle of kindling, became part of something larger than survival. It became the beginning of a bond that would endure, long after the snow had melted and the ridge was once more alive with the quiet stirrings of spring. Spring was still tentative in Wyoming that year. Even when the sun rose higher, the wind reminded me it was not yet time to celebrate warmth. Frost lingered stubbornly in the hollows, and snow patches refused to vanish from the ridge. But something had shifted at the Odell place. I noticed it in the way Lorian moved with a little less caution, in the subtle brightness that returned to Clara's eyes, and in Vera's mischievous smile when she dared to race me to the barn. The house was no longer a fragile shelter of survival. It was slowly becoming a home, however imperfect. I began my mornings before dawn, repairing fences, hauling firewood, and tending to my own small fields. By late afternoon, I would ride up the ridge, my pockets filled with food, nails, or any tool that might ease Lorian's burdens. She seldom asked for help, but she accepted it in ways that made me understand her pride was not absence of need, but a shield she had learned to carry. There was strength in her, a quiet resolve that had survived winters harsher than I could imagine. One evening, I arrived with a basket of eggs and a bundle of firewood. The ridge was glazed with ice that caught the fading light, making the climb slow and cautious. Smoke from the chimney rose steadily now, a clear signal that the hearth was alive, that life persisted. Lorian was outside when I arrived, kneeling to mend a fence rail. Her hair was damp from the spring thaw, strands clinging to her face, and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, showing forearms hardened by work. I approached quietly, letting her finish the hammering before offering my bundle. She accepted it with a nod, eyes briefly meeting mine, and I sensed the trust that had begun to root itself deeper with every day I showed up. The girls had already retreated inside, their small footsteps echoing across the wooden floor as they prepared a simple meal. Clara waved at me from the doorway, and Vera peered out, hesitant but curious, the gap-toothed smile still wide. I passed them the eggs and offered a small smile, the warmth of the gesture bridging the gap that had existed between us. I stayed that evening longer than usual, helping Lorian arrange the firewood and repair a broken latch on the pantry door. The room smelled faintly of cornbread and pine, comforting against the sharp chill outside. Every movement she made was precise, economical, like someone who had learned early that wasted effort could cost more than time. It could cost survival. I marveled at her strength and silently promised myself that I would do all I could to lighten her load, even if it meant my own hands bore the ache of endless work. When supper was ready, we ate quietly. I watched as Lorian passed the plates to the girls, noting the way her hand lingered near theirs, an unspoken acknowledgment of the fragile trust she held for me. The evening settled around us, the wind softened by the ridge and the smoke curling through the chimney. In that silence, I understood that this was what mattered, not grand gestures or declarations, but the constancy of presence, the unwavering commitment to bear witness to life in its simplest forms. The days that followed carried a rhythm that became sacred. I rode up the ridge without hesitation, each trip reinforcing a bond one had not anticipated. Lorien began to allow small gestures of comfort, a cup of tea, a brief nod, a quiet smile. The girls began to expect me, racing to the door with anticipation, laughter spilling like sunlight over the frozen landscape. And though I did not speak much, nor she, the communication between us grew without words. Actions, not phrases, became the language of our understanding. I remember one particular day when I brought a small bundle of cloth and sewing supplies. Lorien had been working on patching the girls' winter clothes, and I offered my hands, awkwardly at first, helping thread needles and cut fabric. She did not comment, but the look she gave me, a mixture of appreciation and mild amusement, was enough. It was a quiet victory, but a victory nonetheless. The girls, curious, hovered near the table, learning how to mend under her guidance, and I watched them with an unfamiliar tenderness, realizing that my role here had grown beyond mere helper. Evenings grew warmer as the sun lingered longer over the ridge. I began to notice the soft hues of early spring, small green shoots pushing through thawed soil, buds swelling on trees, and the faint scent of wildflowers carried on the wind. Lorien would step outside with the children, letting them play while she tended to her chores. I observed them from the barn or the fence, feeling the quiet swell of admiration for a woman who had endured so much and still found ways to nurture life around her. Every return ride carried a sense of anticipation. I knew the moments I arrived would not always be grand or full of celebration, but they would be real, tangible, and meaningful. By now, the Odell place was no longer a symbol of struggle alone. It had become a symbol of resilience, of care, of slowly forged trust. And in the shadow of Wyoming's rugged hills, I began to feel that perhaps, just perhaps, this fragile community of three, the mother, the children, and myself, could endure anything the harsh land might throw at us. Nightfall brought long shadows across the ridge, but the house glowed faintly through the frosted windows. I lingered at the door, watching Lorien tuck the girls into bed, her voice low and soothing. Even when they were asleep, I remained near, knowing that every night held its own uncertainties, every dawn carried a challenge yet to be met. And still, I rode back each day, drawn by something deeper than duty or kindness, a sense that I had found a place where presence mattered, where endurance was rewarded, and where bonds, once formed, could weather storms far harsher than any snow Wyoming could offer. The days grew longer, and with them came the subtle warmth that Wyoming had promised but seldom delivered. The snow that had lingered in the hollows was finally retreating, revealing the brown-gray earth beneath. Mud replaced frost along the trail, and the smell of wet soil filled the air, sharp and earthy. Every morning, I would mount my horse before dawn, taking the narrow, rutted path up Widow's Ridge. The animals in the fields stirred at the first light, their breath visible in the crisp air, while I pressed onward, carrying supplies that might seem ordinary but to Lorien and her daughters meant the difference between hunger and sustenance. Lorien was always there to meet me, though the children occasionally ran ahead to greet me at the gate. Vera's laughter was high and clear, echoing across the ridge as she chased Clara around the small yard. Their bare feet left prints in the wet earth, and I felt a rare ache in my chest, a mixture of longing and admiration for a life so simple yet so unyielding in its demands. I handed Lorien the bundle I carried, flour, dried beans, a tin of salted pork. She took them with a quiet nod, her hands steady despite the work she had done all morning, her eyes scanning the ridge as though calculating the next task, the next trial to endure. I never stayed too long, mindful that her independence was as vital to her as the fire that burned steadily in the hearth. But my presence had become a rhythm she no longer ignored. She had begun leaving small tokens for me, a mug of sweetened tea placed on the doorstep, a jar of honey from her meager collection, a loaf of bread slightly browned but still warm. I would smile silently, understanding without words the trust and acknowledgement these gestures carried. One afternoon, I found her struggling with the barn door. The rusted hinge refused to bend, and the latch was stubborn. I dismounted silently, letting her continue until I felt her pause, and then I stepped closer. Together we worked in tandem, her hands strong and precise, mine steady and patient. The door yielded at last, creaking softly in a way that seemed to signal victory, not over the iron, but over circumstance itself. I left her with a nod, not a word, feeling a quiet satisfaction that our efforts, small as they were, brought something tangible to the Odell place. Spring rains began soon after, soaking the ridge, turning paths into streams and forcing me to wade carefully to avoid spooking the horse. The Odell girls adapted quickly, their bare feet growing tough against the chill of muddy grass. Clara took to helping Lorian tend the small garden, planting beans, radishes, and potatoes. Vera, less patient with precision, ran between the house and the barn, her small hands catching fallen petals and leaves, laughing when she slipped in the mud. Lorian watched them with a soft expression, one that only softened further when she glanced my way. I could see the gratitude, subtle but unmistakable, in her eyes, and I carried that with me every time I left. One evening, the wind carried the scent of damp earth and blossoms as I climbed the ridge. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the yard, and I noticed Lorian sitting quietly on the porch, her hands folded over a piece of linen she was sewing. The children were inside, finishing their simple supper. She looked up at me as I approached, and for the first time, I felt the tension in her shoulders ease noticeably at my presence. She did not speak, yet the invitation was clear. I sat on the step beside her, silent, feeling the warmth of her shoulder and the quiet rhythm of life continuing, uninterrupted by the chaos that often plagued the outside world. It was during these moments I realized that the bond we were forming was not fleeting. It was built from small, deliberate actions. Me bringing food, her allowing me to help, the children learning that someone else cared for them. The ridge, once a harsh, unyielding place, had become a sanctuary of trust and tentative comfort. And though words were few, the understanding between us grew heavier than any conversation. The coming weeks demanded more from all of us. We faced torrential rains, muddy fields, and broken fences that needed constant repair. I spent mornings repairing the pasture fences, afternoons riding up with provisions, and evenings helping with chores or mending clothes. Lorian never asked me to stay, but each day she allowed me to linger longer, a quiet acceptance that her burdens could be shared, if only for a moment. I found myself watching her closely, noting the way her hair caught the sunlight, the strength in her hands as she worked tirelessly, the softness that occasionally surfaced in a glance toward me. The girls began to change as well. Clara, once cautious and quiet, grew bold, chasing after the horse or helping carry bundles. Vera, full of energy and mischief, began to emulate her mother's patience, learning the subtle lessons in endurance and quiet determination. I watched them, understanding that the presence of a consistent, reliable figure in their lives mattered more than any instruction I could give. My role had shifted, no longer just a neighbor or helper, but a part of the fragile ecosystem that Lorian had fought so hard to maintain. By the end of the month, the Odell place had transformed subtly but significantly. The fire in the hearth burned more steadily, the garden showed tentative shoots of green, and the children's laughter filled spaces that had been silent for too long. Lorian's eyes carried a spark of hope I had never seen before, and I knew that every climb up the ridge, every day spent hauling supplies, every quiet evening on the porch had begun to yield something greater than survival. It was yielding life, community, and trust. The days grew warmer, though Wyoming was never gentle with its seasons. The thaw had arrived unevenly, leaving patches of ice and pools of mud along the trails, but also revealing the stubborn green that had survived the harsh winter. Every morning, I rode up Widow's Ridge with the same determined rhythm, my horse navigating the treacherous tracks, my saddle packed with provisions and tools. Each day brought new challenges, a broken fence post, a garden patch that had been waterlogged, a barn door that refused to stay shut. But with each small repair, each bundle of food, I felt a growing sense of purpose, not just in helping Lorien, but in being part of a life that needed stability, care, and steady hands. Lorien had adapted to the rhythm of our shared days. She moved with quiet precision, her hands skilled from years of labor, her eyes always assessing the smallest detail, whether it was the way the children stacked their firewood or how the garden rose leaned against the wind. She no longer flinched when I approached, no longer hesitated before allowing me to help. Instead, she met me with a nod, a glance, a brief smile that spoke volumes more than words ever could. The girls ran ahead on the path as soon as they saw me, their laughter echoing over the ridge, the sound a balm to the quiet ache of my early mornings. Clara, older and more serious, had taken to helping Lorien with chores, learning quickly the way to tend the garden and care for the chickens. Vera, wild and impatient, often left a trail of overturned soil and stray petals, but she learned too, slowly, how to channel her energy into something that sustained, rather than merely disrupted. I noticed the subtle changes in Lorien first. She moved with more ease, her back straighter, her shoulders less burdened. When she spoke, her voice carried a softness that winter had stolen away. She no longer pressed her lips into a thin line as she surveyed her work or the children's mischief. Instead, she allowed herself moments of quiet enjoyment, pausing to watch the ridge glow under the rising sun, to smell the wet earth after the rain, to linger on the porch while Vera chased butterflies through the garden. She had begun leaving small tokens for me, a jar of dried herbs, a loaf of bread slightly scorched but fragrant, a folded piece of cloth she had patched herself. Each gesture, no matter how simple, was a bridge between us, unspoken but understood. One afternoon, I came across her struggling with the barn roof. The winter had loosened the shingles, and a gap threatened to let rain in during the coming storms. She stood on the lower rung of the ladder, gripping the roof with both hands, her boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. I dismounted quietly, not wanting to startle her, and climbed beside her. Together we worked in silence, passing shingles, hammering nails, steadying each other when the ladder wobbled. The task was grueling, but it yielded satisfaction far greater than any fleeting triumph I had known before. By the time we stepped back, the roof secure and the shingles tight, I realized that every shared labor, every quiet moment of cooperation, was binding us closer than I had anticipated. Evenings became a sanctuary. After the chores were done, after the children were fed and tucked into the warmth of the house, Lorien and I would sit on the porch, sharing a quiet drink or examining the garden for the day's progress. The air carried a scent of wet soil and early blossoms, mingling with the smoke from the hearth and the faint sweetness of the wild roses beginning to bloom. These moments required no words. Our presence was enough, our proximity a testament to a slowly solidifying trust. The children noticed it too. Vera began running to the gate before I even arrived, her small hands waving, her grin wide and unapologetic. Clara, more reserved, began to offer me help without being asked, carrying bundles of wood or tidying the path as I dismounted. Lorien would watch them, her eyes softening, but never in a way that suggested weakness. Instead, there was pride in her gaze, a recognition that our lives were merging in small, deliberate steps, each one building towards something enduring. Spring storms arrived unpredictably, rattling the windows, soaking the fields, turning the ridge into a muddy labyrinth. I would ride through the worst of it, the wind biting at my face, my coat soaked, my boots heavy with mud. And every time, Lorien would be waiting, standing steady as the children ran to meet me, their laughter defiant against the rain. Together we would tend the animals, secure the barns, and ensure that the garden survived another deluge. Each storm passed, leaving us a little closer, a little more resilient. Through it all, I began noticing how her hands moved, the precision, the strength, the gentleness when tending the children or caring for the animals. I began noticing the way her eyes lingered on the ridge, on the sky, on the distant hills, as though measuring her place in the world. And slowly, I realized that the bond forming between us was no longer born simply of necessity. It had become something deeper, something anchored in respect, trust, and a shared endurance that winter could never take away. One quiet evening, after the sun had dipped behind the ridge and the first stars appeared, Lorien handed me a small bundle of dried flowers. "For the girls," she said softly. I took them carefully, sensing the weight of the gesture. It was not just for the children. It was a message, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection we had forged. I returned her nod with a smile, silently committing to each day, each journey up the ridge, each storm and thaw. The ridge, once a place of isolation and hardship, had transformed under our efforts. The garden began to yield early shoots, the barns held their contents safely, and the children learned the value of labor and care. But the transformation that mattered most was in us, in Lorien, in the girls, and in me. We were becoming a unit, a fragile but growing family, anchored not just in necessity, but in mutual respect, endurance, and a quiet, steady affection that neither of us had anticipated. Summer settled over Wyoming slowly, each day warmer than the last, though the mornings carried the crisp bite of high-altitude air. I rode up Widow's Ridge with the sun burning gold behind me, the trail soft with the remnants of snow and early rains. The garden had grown beyond expectation. Tiny sprouts pushed through the soil, promising vegetables and flowers alike. Lorien's hands, ever steady, worked tirelessly among the rows. Her sleeves rolled to her elbows, dirt tracing the lines of her arms. I watched her sometimes from the porch, letting the horse graze a few yards away, observing her precision and care. Each movement was deliberate, a reflection of her resolve, and I found myself admiring not just her diligence but the quiet strength she radiated, strength born from necessity, honed through loss. The children had learned to anticipate my visits. Vera, wild and insistent, often ran ahead, her laughter cutting through the morning air like a bell. Clara followed more cautiously, yet with a sense of purpose, carrying the eggs or bundles of herbs Lorien had prepared for the day. Lorien herself moved with a rhythm I had grown to recognize, balancing work and care, guiding the girls with patience, and yet never letting the weight of responsibility bow her spirit. Her eyes would sometimes flick toward me as I approached, a small acknowledgement that spoke of trust, of a bond neither spoken nor forced. One morning I found her by the creek, her dress damp from kneeling by the water, attempting to mend a broken basket. The sun glinted off the rippling surface, casting shifting light on her face and hair, strands falling loose from the twist she had pinned up. She looked up at me, surprise softening into recognition, and then returned to her work. I approached quietly, setting my horse down and picking my way over the wet stones. The basket was torn along the seams, but her hands moved with precision, weaving the fibers back together with patience and care. I knelt beside her, offering the tools I carried, and together we repaired it, wordless but attuned to the rhythm of each other's movements. The barn needed attention as well. Its roof, though reinforced after the winter storms, had begun to sag under the weight of rainwater and the wind's persistent pressure. Lorien stood atop the ladder, gripping the frame with one hand, the other steadying herself against the slope. I climbed beside her, my hands steadying the wood, hammering the nails into place, each strike echoing in the quiet of the ridge. The sweat ran down our faces, mingling with the dust of the wood, and yet the labor brought a quiet satisfaction, an affirmation that the work we did together held meaning beyond the immediate tasks. It was more than mending wood. It was the building of trust, the creation of a life stitched together by effort, patience, and shared endurance. Evenings had begun to stretch longer, the sunlight lingering over the horizon, and I often stayed past the point where I would have ridden back, helping Lorien with the children, the garden, or simple repairs around the house. Sometimes we would sit on the porch, the girls playing in the yard, the warm air carrying the scent of soil and new blooms. She would lean back against the railing, hands folded loosely in her lap, eyes tracing the horizon where the sun dipped behind the distant hills. And I would sit near her, not pressing, not demanding attention, simply present, witness to the quiet transformation unfolding before me. The children's laughter had become a soundtrack to these days. Vera's energy was boundless, and she often attempted tasks too large for her small frame, tumbling and laughing, while Clara's careful observations ensured that mistakes were corrected before they became accidents. Lorien guided them with patience, correcting gently, praising where due, and yet there was a lightness in her demeanor that had been absent during the harsh winter months. The girls were learning resilience, yes, but also joy, the knowledge that work could be rewarding, and that care, when shared, could create warmth even in the coldest landscape. Storms still came, unpredictable and fierce, but our routine had built a shield against them. I would ride through the worst, carrying supplies and reassurances, and Lorien would meet me at the door, the children in tow, faces flushed with excitement and relief. Together we would tend to the animals, secure the barns, and ensure the garden survived another deluge. Each storm passed, leaving a residue of closeness, a tacit understanding that we were stronger together than apart. One evening, the sun burning low in the sky, Lorien handed me a small loaf of bread, the crust golden and fragrant, her hands slightly trembling from exertion. "For the girls," she said, though her eyes lingered on mine a fraction longer than necessary. I took it carefully, feeling the weight of both the gesture and the trust it represented. In that moment, I understood fully that our bond had deepened beyond simple necessity. It had become the foundation of something enduring, something neither of us had expected but both had quietly hoped for. The ridge itself seemed to reflect this transformation. Where once snow and wind had dominated, green shoots now pushed through the thawed earth. The garden yielded small but promising crops. The barns, once battered and fragile, now stood secure and purposeful. The children, growing in skill and confidence, mirrored the steadiness of Lorien herself. And we, Lorien, the girls, and I, had become a single rhythm, a unity forged through hardship, resilience, and quiet devotion. By late July, the days had grown long and the sun high, baking the ridge with dry heat that whispered of a harsher season ahead. I rode up early one morning, saddle creaking beneath me, the trail dust rising in soft clouds with each step of my horse. Lorien had begun her day before dawn, as always. The smell of cornmeal mush still clung to the kitchen, mingling with the sweetness of wildflowers she had gathered to sprinkle near the windows. The girls were already outside, chasing one another across the yard, squealing and laughing as if the trials of winter were nothing but a distant memory. I dismounted and let my horse graze, taking a moment to watch them. Vera darted forward like a spark, her shadow stretching across the dry grass. Clara moved with more deliberate grace, her eyes scanning the yard, ensuring her sister didn't stumble or fall. Lorien appeared on the porch then, hair pulled back, dress dusted with the residue of early gardening, hands on her hips as she observed them. There was a smile hidden in the corner of her mouth, subtle but present, one that spoke of quiet pride and relief. The work of summer was different from the winter we had endured. The garden needed tending daily, the animals cared for constantly, and the house required maintenance against heat and sudden storms. I had taken to carrying supplies, tools, and seeds, often staying long hours beside Lorien as she planted, mended, or sorted through the day's tasks. She moved with calm authority, each motion purposeful, yet her eyes frequently sought mine, a silent acknowledgment that the burden shared was lighter than the one borne alone. One day, the wind shifted unexpectedly, carrying a hot current that smelled faintly of distant fire. The girls were at the edge of the ridge, their laughter interrupted as they turned toward the direction of the smell. Lorien's eyes narrowed as she stepped forward, scanning the horizon. I approached from behind her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Storms coming, or fire," I said, voice low. Her eyes met mine, steady but concerned, and she nodded. We gathered the children swiftly, ushering them inside, securing doors and windows, checking the animals. Every motion was practiced, our shared rhythm forming without words, as if the ridge itself had taught us how to survive together. After the air settled and the distant smoke faded, Lorien sank into a chair, hands gripping the arms tightly. I knelt beside her, offering water, my thumb brushing against her fingers. Her eyes were damp, and yet there was strength there, strength born from enduring the worst and surviving. The girls peeked from behind the curtain, eyes wide but trusting, and I felt a quiet pride in our small, fragile family. We had weathered winter, spring, and now the challenges of summer, not just surviving but growing stronger, closer. I spent evenings helping Lorien repair fences or barns that had weathered the spring storms. Each board, each nail, each repair carried more than utility. It carried the unspoken testament of our partnership. She would pass me tools, guide my hands where needed, and sometimes simply stand beside me, letting the work speak for itself. We had reached a point where words were often unnecessary, our bond conveyed in gestures, glances, and shared effort. At night, we would sit on the porch, the girls asleep in the loft above, the air carrying the scent of wild roses and earth. Lorien would lean against me, hand lightly resting on mine, and I would watch the ridge in silence. Each star above seemed brighter, each shadow gentler. She never needed to speak of fear or loneliness. It was enough that we faced it together. Sometimes she whispered plans for the future, small dreams of improving the barn, planting more flowers, or even teaching the girls to read better. I listened, offering what suggestions I could, but mostly just being present, a witness to her resilience and her hope. The ridge had changed since winter. Where once there had been only the white of snow and the starkness of isolation, there was now green, life, and warmth. Our days were long, filled with labor and laughter, sweat and care, and yet there was something deeper forming, something unspoken, yet palpable. Lorien's glance met mine more frequently now, holding something tender and open. I felt it too, the pull of attachment beyond necessity, beyond friendship, into something richer, more enduring. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the western hills, I helped Lorien hang a new curtain she had sewn for the kitchen window. The golden light fell across her face, illuminating the determination in her eyes and the softness of her features. She paused, brush of her fingers lingering on the cloth, and I saw the moment of quiet vulnerability, a small break in the armor she carried so carefully. I reached out, placing a hand near hers, not touching yet close enough to feel the warmth of her skin. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn away. Instead, she nodded, a silent permission to remain, to stand near, to witness her strength and tenderness in equal measure. The girls tumbled in from the yard then, laughter spilling like sunlight across the porch. We settled into a rhythm of evening chores, preparing supper, checking animals, tending the garden one last time before night fully fell. By the time darkness wrapped the ridge, Lorien and I stood together, observing the quiet below, the fire in the hearth casting a gentle glow across her features. Her hand found mine again, this time with certainty, a small but undeniable signal of trust, of reliance, and perhaps of something more. That summer continued, day after day, each moment weaving our lives together more intricately. We were no longer just a man and a woman connected by circumstance. We were partners, friends, guardians, and slowly, something deeper bloomed. In the midst of labor and laughter, of sun and storm, of resilience and care, we were forming a family. Not just the three of us surviving, but 5 hearts learning to beat together in time with the ridge, the land, and one another. August had arrived, bringing with it relentless sun and dry air that made the soil crack beneath our boots. The ridge had transformed from the stark white of winter to the gold and green of summer's full bloom, yet every day held its own trials. Lorien moved among the garden, checking beans, corn, and squash, her hands blackened with soil, and the girls running along behind her like little sparks of energy. I brought water from the spring every morning, the leather bucket straps cutting into my palms, but my eyes were on Lorien more than on the work. Her focus never wavered, even as the heat bore down, but I could see the fatigue lining her shoulders, the way she rubbed her wrists after long hours. The ridge was quiet save for the rustle of wind through the sparse trees and the hum of cicadas in the afternoon sun. Each day I would ride up with supplies, fresh bread, salted pork, and sometimes small comforts I thought might lighten their burdens. Lorien would take them with a nod, not a word, but the way her eyes softened when they met mine said more than any words could. The girls had grown bolder, often running to meet me at the edge of the porch, their laughter ringing through the air. Clara had begun to mimic my actions in the garden, asking me how to mend fences or tie knots, while Vera's curiosity took her to every corner of the yard, pointing out every beetle or flower she found. As August wore on, the heat made the air heavy and slow. Lorien and I found ourselves lingering in the shade of the barn, hands occasionally brushing, sharing brief smiles while the girls chased each other across the yard. There was a rhythm to our days now, one that did not need constant conversation. I understood her glances, her subtle nods, her half-smiles, and she understood mine. Each gesture was a thread weaving the fabric of our growing bond, the foundation of a connection built on shared toil, trust, and quiet understanding. One late afternoon, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and the ominous weight of change. The girls paused, turning toward the ridge with wide eyes. Lorien's expression tightened as she scanned the horizon. I dismounted silently, my horse picking its way through the uneven path, and approached her from behind. My hand found her shoulder, a gentle anchor in the shifting moment. Together, we watched the distant flicker of smoke, the reminder that the world beyond our ridge was unpredictable and harsh. Yet there was no panic, only action. Lorien directing the girls to the safety of the house, checking the animals, securing doors and windows. Every motion was deliberate, a testament to the knowledge we had gained through months of survival and cooperation. The sun began to dip behind the western hills, casting long shadows across the ridge. We sat on the porch, catching our breaths, Lorien leaning slightly against me as we watched the girls play quietly in the yard now that the threat had passed. Her hand rested lightly in mine, an unspoken acknowledgment of our shared effort and the bond that had grown between us. It was a fragile peace, built on days of sweat, labor, and perseverance, yet it felt unshakable in that moment. Evenings were spent tending to the house and barn, repairing boards, hammering nails, and reinforcing the fence lines. Lorien moved beside me, guiding my hands, passing tools, or simply standing near, her presence steady and reassuring. We worked in silence often, but that silence was comfortable, filled with the unspoken knowledge that we were there for one another, ready to shoulder the burdens of ridge, land, and family together. One night, after the girls were asleep, Lorien and I sat on the porch steps, watching the stars appear above. She leaned against me, head resting lightly on my shoulder, and I felt the weight of the summer days melt into something warmer, something tender. We spoke quietly of future plans, small things like expanding the barn, planting more flowers, teaching the girls to read better, but each word carried with it the promise of continuity, the hope that we would endure together. As the ridge darkened and the wind carried the cool whisper of coming autumn, I realized that this bond we had formed was no longer about survival alone. It was about choosing each other, day after day, through hardship and joy, labor and laughter. Lorien's glance met mine in the soft lamplight, unguarded now, open and honest. I reached for her hand, pressing it gently against my chest, feeling the beat of her pulse, the assurance of presence, and the promise of partnership. That August night, as the first chill of fall hinted at its arrival, I knew that our days on the ridge were no longer just about enduring. They were about living, together, fully, and with intention. The ridge, once stark and empty, had become home not merely for survival, but for love, for family, for a future we would build with our own hands and hearts. September crept over the ridge with a hush, the air turning crisp, the fields losing their deep summer green. The girls noticed it first. the way their breath began to fog in the mornings, the way the sun sank faster beyond the tree-line. Lorien noticed it in the garden, where the leaves yellowed and the soil hardened against the coming frost. And I noticed it most in the silence that settled over us each evening, the knowledge that another winter was not far behind, and with it new trials. The ridge had grown comfortable in summer, but comfort on land like this was a fragile thing. I found myself scanning the horizon more often, listening for the howl of wolves, the crack of a breaking branch, or worse, the approach of strangers. Lorien, too, seemed more vigilant. She carried herself with calmness, but I could see the way her hand lingered near the door latch, the way her eyes flicked to the rifle resting above the hearth whenever an unfamiliar sound cut through the stillness. One evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, Clara ran breathless into the yard. "Mama! Someone's on the trail!" she cried, eyes wide with both fear and wonder. Lorien froze, hands tight on the wash she'd been wringing. I grabbed my rifle and moved to the porch, scanning the path that cut down from the ridge. Sure enough, a figure was approaching on horseback, riding slow, deliberate, as if he already knew this place belonged to someone else. Lorien stiffened behind me, her voice low and sharp. "I don't know him." The rider drew closer, his face shadowed by a wide hat, his clothes dusty, worn from travel. But there was something in his posture, a practiced ease, that set my nerves on edge. He reined in his horse just shy of the porch, tipping his hat slightly, eyes glinting with something that wasn't quite friendliness. "Evenin'," he drawled. "Didn't reckon I'd find folk up this ridge." Lorien stepped forward then, her daughters close behind her legs. "This is our home," she said firmly, her voice steady though I could hear the strain beneath it. "You're passing through, I expect?" The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe. Maybe not. Heard tell of a widow livin' out here, with 2 little girls. Heard she might need help keepin' things safe." His gaze shifted to me then, sharp and measuring. I gripped the rifle tighter, feeling Lorien's presence at my side, her strength bolstering mine. "We don't need your kind of help," I said evenly. "Best you keep movin'." For a moment, the ridge held its breath. The girls clung to their mother, eyes wide. Lorien's hand brushed lightly against my arm, not to pull me back, but to steady me, to let me know she stood with me. The rider studied us a heartbeat longer, then spat into the dirt and tugged on his reins. "Suit yourselves," he muttered, turning his horse back toward the trail. But the look he left behind was not one of surrender. It was a promise. When he was gone, Lorien exhaled sharply, pulling the girls close. I lowered the rifle, but did not release the tension in my chest. We both knew this ridge was not untouched. It carried its dangers, wild and human alike, and those dangers had now come close enough to see our faces. That night, the fire burned low as Lorien sat by the hearth, brushing Vera's hair, her eyes distant. Clara sat beside her, leaning against her arm, silent. I sat opposite, the rifle across my knees. The weight of unspoken thoughts filled the room, but eventually, Lorien's gaze lifted to mine. "He'll come back," she said quietly. "I didn't argue. Then we'll be ready." Her eyes lingered on me, searching, as if measuring the truth of those words. Finally she nodded, a small gesture, but one that carried immense weight. The bond we had built through long months of survival had now become something deeper. Trust in the face of danger, loyalty that reached beyond choice, beyond circumstance. In the days that followed, we worked harder than ever. The fences were reinforced, the doors double-bolted, the rifle kept always within reach. I taught Clara how to check the traps with me, her small hands mimicking mine as I showed her the signs of disturbance. Lorien stayed close to the house, watching the trail whenever she went to the garden, her movements purposeful, her presence fierce. The girls, though quieter now, seemed to understand the change. Their play was softer, closer to home, their eyes often flicking to the ridge as though expecting shadows. Yet amid that tension, something else grew. Lorien and I found ourselves side by side more often, her shoulder brushing mine as we worked, her hand lingering when she passed me tools. At night, when the girls were asleep, she sat closer by the fire, her silence a comfort instead of distance. The storm that threatened beyond the ridge only drew us nearer, forged us tighter, as though the land itself was testing the strength of what we had built. One evening, as the wind howled through the trees and rattled the shutters, Lorien placed a hand over mine where it rested on my knee. Her touch was firm, grounding. "Whatever comes," she whispered, "we face it together." I looked into her eyes then, and for the first time, I saw not only strength and resilience, but something deeper, an openness she had kept hidden, a flicker of something she dared not name before. And I knew, as the storm raged outside and the ridge held its breath, that I would do anything to protect this woman, these children, this fragile, fierce little world we had made together. For danger was coming, that much was certain, and with it, the test of everything we had fought to build. October settled over the ridge like a warning. The trees flamed red and gold before shedding into skeletal black, and the wind cut sharper with each passing day. Lorien and I had been bracing ourselves since that evening when the stranger rode away, and though weeks passed without his return, the sense of his presence lingered like a shadow that would not leave. Every creak of the woods at night set the dogs barking. Every gust that rattled the shutters sent the girls diving closer to their mother. And every time I saddled my horse to ride out for supplies, Lorien's eyes held mine with a quiet plea. "Be careful, come back." I always did. But in my chest there grew a steady pressure, an awareness that peace, as fragile as glass, was waiting to shatter. It came one night just as the first frost sealed the ground. The girls had been tucked in under quilts, the fire banked low. Lorien and I sat on the porch steps, wrapped in the heavy silence of the ridge. That was when the dogs went wild, snarling, pulling against their chains. The sound came next, the crack of a twig in the dark, too heavy for deer, too cautious for bear. My hand tightened around the rifle. Lorien's hand brushed mine, not stopping me, not softening me, but anchoring me. Then the voices came. Low at first, muttered, then sharper, clearer. More than one. The stranger had not only returned, he had brought others. I slipped down the steps, motioning for Lorien to take the girls and bar the door. She hesitated, her jaw set, before nodding once. Her strength was never in leaving, but in knowing when to hold fast. As the door shut behind her, I moved toward the fence line. 3 figures emerged from the tree-lean. The stranger rode at the front, hat low, a cruel smile twisting his mouth. The other 2 walked behind, rifles slung, eyes scanning like wolves on the hunt. "Well now," the stranger drawled, pulling his horse to a stop. "Told you I'd be back. Thought maybe I'd pay proper call this time. See if the lady of the ridge might reconsider my offer." I raised the rifle. "Turn around. You're not welcome here." He chuckled, dismounting with a slow, deliberate ease. "Thing is, fella, welcome or not, winter's comin'. Land like this, isolated, fertile, it's a prize. And folk like you, just standin' in the way." The men behind him shifted, their boots crunching frost, their rifles heavy in their hands. My heart hammered, but my grip was steady. Behind me, I knew Lorien was inside, the girls tucked close, her own rifle ready if need be. "You'll not take this place," I said, voice low, resolute. For a moment, the ridge was silent but for the wind and the restless stamping of the horse. Then, sudden as lightning, one of the men raised his gun. A shot rang out, shattering the stillness. The dogs lunged against their chains, barking wild. I fired back, the crack echoing across the ridge. One of the men stumbled, cursed, dropped low. Chaos exploded. The stranger dove behind the fence post, shouting orders. Bullets tore through the night air, splintering wood, cutting close. I ducked, rolling into the shallow ditch by the garden, breath ragged, rifle braced against my shoulder. Another shot. Another. Dirt sprayed where bullets struck. Then, through the din, I heard it, the sharp crack of a rifle from the porch. Lorien. She had taken her post by the window, and her aim was true. One of the attackers cried out, stumbling into the shadows. The stranger snarled, his voice rising with fury. Stubborn folk. You'll pay for this. But we held. Every time he pressed forward, Lorien's fire pushed him back. Every time he tried to circle, I cut him off. We fought not just for land, not just for shelter, but for each other, for the fragile life we had built day by day. The battle stretched long into the night. Smoke hung heavy, the ground torn with footprints and blood. At last, the two men faltered, retreating into the woods with curses on their lips. The stranger lingered, hatred burning in his eyes, before finally swinging into his saddle. "This ain't over," he spat, voice low and venomous. Then he wheeled his horse and vanished into the trees. Silence fell, broken only by the labored breathing of the dogs, the distant rustle of branches. Slowly, I lowered my rifle, my body trembling with the aftermath. The door creaked open behind me. Lorien stepped out, rifle still in hand, her hair loose, eyes fierce. The lamplight spilled behind her, framing her like a sentinel. The girls clung to her skirts, wide-eyed but alive. Safe. Our eyes met across the distance, and something passed between us, something stronger than fear, deeper than relief. It was the unshakable certainty that whatever storms came, whatever battles loomed, we would face them together. Lorien stepped down, closing the space between us. She touched my arm, grounding me once more, and whispered, "You held the ridge." I shook my head, glancing toward the house, the girls, the yard scarred by bullets and smoke. We held it. The ridge, scarred but unbroken, had been tested that night. And so had we. But in my heart I knew, the final test was still ahead. The ridge never forgot blood. The earth, even beneath the first dusting of winter snow, carried the memory of what had happened, the churned dirt, the shattered fence posts, the echoes of gunfire. Yet as the sun rose the following morning, the land stood quiet, resilient, as though reminding us that survival was not just possible, but demanded. Lorien moved through the house with a calm strength, her daughters close to her side. They had seen fear, heard death thunder outside their walls, yet when morning came, they carried on, helping mend the garden gate, feeding the chickens, clinging not to terror but to routine. That was Lorien's gift. She taught her girls that resilience was not born of ignoring fear, but of living despite it. The stranger never returned. Perhaps he nursed his wounds in some other hollow of the wilderness, or perhaps the ridge itself warned him away. But even in his absence, the bond forged in those nights of fire and smoke remained. Lorien and I no longer had to speak of what we were. It was in every glance, every hand that lingered too long when passing tools, every night she sat a little closer by the fire. It was no longer a question of survival. It was a promise. As winter deepened, I often found myself looking out across the frozen fields, the cabin glowing warm behind me. Once, this ridge had been just land, a place to endure. Now it was more. It was home, because of them, because of her. One evening, as snow fell soft and thick outside, I found Lorien by the fire, the girls asleep under quilts. She looked up at me, her eyes tired but steady. I sat beside her, and for the first time, she leaned against me without hesitation, her head resting on my shoulder. "Do you think it will ever end?" she asked quietly. I took her hand, threading my fingers through hers. "Danger doesn't end," I said. "But neither does what we've built." For a long moment, we sat like that, the crackle of the fire filling the silence. And in that silence, I realized the truth. The ridge was no longer just a place we defended. It was the life we had made together, the laughter of children, the shared labor of long days, the love that had grown slowly, stubbornly, like roots beneath frozen ground. Winter would come again. Strangers might return. Wolves might howl. But whatever came, we would face it not as scattered souls clinging to survival, but as a family. And on that ridge, through the cold and the storms and the endless turning of seasons, that was enough. If you were in her place, facing the harsh Wyoming winter alone with nothing but your daughters, would you fight the same battle? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, and explore the other stories waiting for you on screen.